let's talk about the formation of the New Testament canon. A process that spanned more than 3 centuries, the formation of the New Testament canon was long and complex. With the possible exception of Luke-Acts, each of the 27 eventually canonical books originated separately and at first circulated independently of the others. Although the 4 Gospels, Acts, and Paul's letters were generally accepted by about AD 200, other books such as James, Revelation, and 2 Peter were disputed well into the 4th century. Only gradually were these writings gathered together into a single volume with contents identical to those of today. The debate for canonization in the early church was based largely around the writings after the time of Jesus. The Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, was already viewed as authoritative and therefore acceptable. The process of canonization determined which books should be included beyond the Old Testament. The criteria that figured most prominently into the thinking of the church were apostolicity, Catholicity, orthodoxy, traditional and established usage, and inspiration. First, let's look at apostolicity. They would ask, was a book or letter written by an apostle? And what was the author's connection to the apostles and thus to Christ? The concept apostolic could connote, beyond direct apostolic authorship by followers of apostles, derivation from the general time of the apostles, or even simply an agreement of content with what the church took to be apostolic teaching. Next, Catholicity, where they would ask, was the document relevant to the universal church? Paul's letters were disputed because they were specifically addressed to individual churches. What is at work in the use of this criterion is the church's desire to eschew limited private and esoteric resources and to prefer broadly accessible and relevant documents. Next, orthodoxy, where they would ask, did the document's content agree with the faith and doctrine of the church? This criteria was circular. The synoptic gospels and the writings of Paul were not put to this criterion because they were already widely accepted and used. This criterion thus was applied to those texts which had questionable authority. Next, traditional usage, where they would ask, was a document used in worship and teaching in the churches? This was a retrospective approach primarily in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Some writings which were used were excluded from the canon, and others which were used more sparingly were canonized, such as James and 2 Peter. Next, inspiration. The church recognized the Old Testament as being inspired by God, but at first it did not claim such for the Christian writings. When the writings began being used commonly with the Old Testament, they began being viewed as inspired as well. While the authority of the canon is argued on this point, it does not appear to have been a primary criteria of the church. Although approximately 5,000 manuscripts containing all or part of the New Testament survive, only a few small fragments date back as early as the first half of the 2nd century AD. The oldest extant manuscripts of a few individual books were composed about AD 200, but the earliest copies of the complete New Testament were not produced until the time of Constantine, circa AD 325. Because none of the author's original documents exist, we only have several generations of copies, and no 2 of these surviving manuscript copies are precisely alike. It is extremely difficult for scholars to compile a reasonably reliable text of the Christian Greek scriptures from which English translations can be made. Based on the pioneering labors of Wycliffe and Tyndale, the King James Bible of AD 1611 became the most popular translation in the English-speaking world. More recent translations, however, such as the New English Bible, are based on older manuscripts that were not available to the King James scholars and offer more exact approximations of the original Greek.